Hi everybody, Don Prezant from Canada. I'm here to talk to you today about badge frameworks and how they can better support the recognition ecosystem that we all want to build. I wear several professional hats. Today I'm mostly wearing my Open Recognition Ambassador hat. I even have the badge to prove it. And I'll be trying to expand your notions about recognition and the ways it can support skills and development and learning through systems. And it's a perspective I've developed over past couple of decades, working first with ePortfolios since about 2004 and with Open Badges since pretty much when they began, 2011, 2012. So I'm going to be walking through a number of concepts here today and hopefully take you along with me. So let's share the screen and get on with it. I'll be hammering on some points as I go through this. Um, it's it's about more than micro-credentials. It's about more than course delivery. Um, I think of badges as vehicles or containers for stories of learning and achievement. It's about lifelong learning, what some people call the 60-year curriculum. And this phrase is going to be familiar to a lot of you. All learning counts, lifelong, life-wide. And more than learning, recognition can be life-wide. It can be formal, semi-formal, or informal. Formal isn't always the best for every single context. And basically, it's talking about recognition, not just as something about recognition or prior learning or credit for prior learning, but open recognition. Open recognition, it's been defined in various ways. In conversations, I usually just say that it's a more inclusive, flexible way of looking at people that goes way beyond that credit for prior learning. It's a framework for human connection in the context of learning, context of working, and just belonging socially, because people seek recognition for different reasons. I work a lot with educators, and certainly recognition can support academic advancement, whether it's credential transfer or recognition or prior experiential learning for credit. But there's more to life than post-secondary education. What about jobs and careers like the ones you're now in, where your degree is maybe just a fading memory? Or other reasons for recognition that may also be valid for people at different points in their lives. Open recognition includes all these things, and sometimes formal recognition is not what's called for. Open recognition was actually inspired by Open Badges back in 2011. I called it the singularity of recognition. All of a sudden, there was Mozilla with an inclusive, accessible, progressive way to make learning and achievement visible. This is me presenting it to the Canadian Association for Prior Learning back in 2012, the same year I took badges to the EPIC conference in Europe that was getting frustrated with ePortfolios. This was ePortfolios one bite at a time. I was pretty buzzed about it at the time. Because learning's not only lifelong, it's also life-wide. Most useful learning actually happens in the wild, outside the classroom. Informal, usually unstructured, in our homes, in our communities, our workplaces, sometimes working with others, sometimes by ourselves as we work, solve problems, get things done that meet our needs, and strive to reach our goals. This is a well-known reference model for workplace performance called 70-20-10. Some people like to argue about the exact percentages, but most of us agree about the basic point. Education and training is only a small part of continuous learning that we need to be able to perform effectively. Open badges were designed to handle this. Trouble is, open badges were also convenient containers for training certificates that could be called micro-credentials. In education, the default solution for a skills gap is all too often a course. That's why most micro-credentials are simply continuing education courses in shiny new clothes. But we can't develop a course for everything. That's like trying to boil the ocean with a one-size-fits-all solution. We need personalized ways to develop, capture, recognize what we learn across our lives, that we can adapt to new situations. We also need it to scale. That's a wicked problem for sure. What is a skill or a competency? Well, most would say it's about more than course outcomes that you can be quizzed on. Miller's pyramid for assessing competencies was developed for health occupations, but it also works well for other kinds of skills and knowledge. The bottom two layers are about really more knowledge and reasoning. The upper two levels are about being able to demonstrate skills and knowledge in simulated practice or real life performance. So the type of assessment changes as you move up the pyramid. And let me ask you, is it more important that the doctor cutting you open got 100% in a multiple choice exam about surgery, or if they have a good surgical track record? And we can go a little far with the rigor. I wasn't part of the coalition that led to the trusted credentials, so I'm only looking at this from the outside. But I do see issues with an approach that says, these are trusted credentials, and this is everything else. Trusted credentials, they got lots of metadata. A little too much in my mind. They kind of filter out a lot of value. And I see issues anyway with a few of the elements, and others are undeveloped. Is anybody doing anything with trusted credentials? Meanwhile, other credentialed or recognition badges, there's no advice about metadata. Is there really no value other than a pat on the head? I think we can build more inclusive and useful frameworks for learning and achievement than this black and white choice. Although, trusted credential could be an endorsement for a particular kind of badge for those organizations who support it. It would actually be great to see examples of that. I'd appreciate it if anybody could let me know. Meanwhile, let's see what we can put together based on what's been happening over the last 15 years since open badges were invented. This Venn diagram from around 2014 helps make the point that open badges support a wide spectrum of formality within a wider spectrum of credentialing. Open badges are a standardized subset of digital badges. Micro-credentials are usually just open badges that are more formal. But some micro-credentials are not even published as open badges. They might just be MOOC certificates, for examples, or verifiable credentials only with no badge. Not all micro-credentials are for academic credit or are stackable into larger credentials. I've included some keywords to characterize both ends of the formality spectrum, but bear in mind that most examples lie somewhere in between these extremes. The overall point here is that open badges can be more than micro-credentials, and micro-credentials themselves can be more than course certificates. Madison College was an early leader in digital badging before the term micro-credentials became popular. Here's a taxonomy they developed for digital badges that were informal or formal that provides more detail about the formal micro-credentially side, including certification as a concept. Madison's Digital Credentials Institute still uses a version of this, so it stood the test of time. I remember Kate Radionoff advising institutions to align their credentials to recognized industry standards, which seemed like good advice to me. What Kate meant was aligning curriculum content to industry standards for domain knowledge, but there are also industry standards for curriculum development and competency assessment, so why not have a look at those? Program certificates are for successfully achieving learning outcomes by completing assessed courses and programs. There's a couple of standards there. Certifications are robust, independent assessments of the knowledge, skills, or competencies required for competent performance in a role. Certificates and certifications are used interchangeably in many circles, but they're actually pretty strictly defined in these standards. These standards cost money, but I've also found this backgrounder from ICE to be very helpful, as well as a Business of Certification book by Lenora Knapp. I like how she says that over-engineering micro-credentials into micro-certifications severely limits their range of use, for example. So I've been working with badges and micro-credentials for a variety of clients since 2012. discussing them in various forums through that time. Here's a LinkedIn article from 2020 with some early thinking on frameworks that still gets a few views every week. Notice a balance between the formal and the informal at the top, and the other types of recognition I was developing for one of the projects is starting to explore applied learning and evidence gathering, among other things. I was putting these ideas to work in different contexts. Inter-American Development Bank, for example. I worked with Stella Porto, who's also presenting at today's Virtual Badge Summit on a spectrum of badges for their context. A performance badge is based on a robust learning experience and summative assessment of the knowledge, skills, and competencies required for competent performance of an occupational or professional role. Others might call this a certification, but they actually avoid that term. An assessment badge is typically based on a course or program where the learning outcomes are assessed, your typical course-based micro-credential. A completion badge is typically awarded for a self-paced course with structured objectives, but less rigorous assessments, such as a knowledge check. A participation badge, you can recognize taking part in a webinar or a workshop, no rigorous assessment again. Milestone badges can recognize learning pathways and aggregated collections of other badges, and flexible recognition badges are for emergent and customizable ways to recognize a wide variety of achievements. Things like specific achievements, experience and participation, volunteer service, community recognition of expertise, etc., etc. There is a community professional badge for individuals who've actively engaged. They're also working towards a community organization badge to recognize organizations who have gone more than just signing an MOU. Stella and I published a paper about this back in 2023, and she and her team have been building on this since, including a really interesting take on the Kirkpatrick levels of evaluation that she's presenting today. I took that work forward to an ongoing engagement with Team Democracy on their civics credentialing framework. Some of you may have met Chris Newland or Jean Marie Halleck in Boulder this year. This is one of my favorite files, actually, partly for the topic, partly for the people, partly for the way it goes beyond training courses into action in the real world. There are 4 broad categories of badges. The competency badges are pretty much micro-credentials, the capability to perform activities or roles. Learning badges represent acquisition of knowledge, but maybe not so assessed. The action badges are earned by actually doing something, actually performing in a role. And appreciation badges are used to cultivate a community through awards, gratitude, etc., membership, and other flexible recognition. And in the middle, between learning and doing, is that commitment to action. I love that. I mentioned achievement types earlier. This is a new optional field in version 3 of Open Badges where you can specify the type of credential you're awarding. The vocabulary is pulled from CTDL, the Credential Transparency Description Language. All of this is great in principle, but I see some issues in practice. As you can see, this is about all credentials, including degrees, professional licenses, trades tickets, etc. But there are some gaps, overlaps, vagueness in the definitions and the chosen terms that I think make for confusion. For gaps, you can add extended terms, which we have done for our badging platform. That's not really a portable solution because those terms aren't shared beyond the platform. They're just allowed. I have to say it's pretty academic. Do we really need 3 ways to list a PhD? And it's very US-centric, which also affects international portability. A client here in Canada recently reminded me that we don't have master's certificate as a trades designation, and it's journey person, not journeyman. I know we're woke. People up here tend to use master's certificate to mean a stacked program of courses, which kind of contributes to the confusion. So this is the start of a good idea, but I say there's more work needed. I'd love to be part of that work, actually. Okay, so based on all these experiences over the years, Learning Agents has developed a framework of badge types that I'm going to build up in front of you. First, a spectrum from formal to informal split between the presence and absence of assessment. That's the border of rigor, so-called, for these types of badges. We provide this framework as a guide for appropriate metadata for those different kinds of badges. It's pretty adaptable, and it's certainly not the only one out there. I've already shared a few examples. A word about terms. Assessment means summative assessment. There are two types of evidence. Direct evidence is authored by the candidate. Indirect evidence is about the candidate. And we see value in recognition across the spectrum of formality. And there should be the ability to move across those different types of formality. For example, layering on a social acceptance to formal credentials, such as in First Nations communities, and leaving room for semi-formal workplace programs to be recommended for formal credit. The next few slides will be a tour of the types ranging from formal to informal. I mentioned certification earlier. It's a term that's often misused. The achievement type definition actually is really good for this. It says time-limited, revocable, renewable credential awarded by an authoritative body for demonstrating the knowledge, skills, and abilities to perform specific tasks or an occupation. Certification standards like ISO, like I was saying before, specify that it should be based on independent assessment and not be tied to taking a particular program. But our classification does allow for non-standard programs because so many of them exist, and a well-designed program with multiple touch points does carry more weight than the outcomes of a single course. Assessed learning is your typical micro-credential course certificate delivered online or in person. There's typically not a lot of differentiation here. Everybody who passes gets the same certificate. Direct evidence and demonstrated performance is a chance to personalize learning and achievement, showing what you know and have done. This is part of what I like to call the assessment littoral zone, that sort of shaded area at the top there. Your evidence package or performance demo may be assessed, or maybe you're putting it out there as a self-assertion. Maybe it will be assessed or at least endorsed later on. Either way, you're showing something at a particular point in time, unlike the next one. Application and performance is a different type of evidence related to performance and experience over time, such as work-integrated learning placement, probation period, or validated work experience in an apprentice logbook. This is also part of the assessment littoral zone, meaning it may be strictly monitored or not. Now we get into organized learning not assessed. We've currently split these into two different types of badges. Learning completion is your typical asynchronous e-learning course, maybe with some knowledge checks, but probably with multiple tries until you get them right. Learning participation is usually live, online, such as a webinar, or in person, such as a half-day workshop. If you stay to the end, you usually get the badge. Organized learning badges are not micro-credentials because there's no summative assessment, but they can provide useful signals of interest and engagement, especially if somebody has a lot of them. And finally, we have flexible recognition, just as Inter-American Development Bank has in their framework. These are adaptable containers for telling stories of learning and achievement, affiliations, and so on. This is where you can issue awards for excellence, volunteer service, and so on. You're not teaching somebody or testing them, you're appreciating them. And that's a good thing in itself, and maybe the person you appreciate will want to share that with others. This type includes self-assertion, sometimes called selfie badges. And I want to jump down that rabbit hole for a second. Open recognition means flexible recognition that includes and empowers learners. That's a reflection of real life. Think about when you're in a job interview and you have to start claiming things and then finding ways to support those claims. The Paris Declaration on the Equality of Recognition told us in 2024 that the act of recognizing is not the sole privilege of accredited authorities. And Open Badges version 3 makes the empowering act of self-assertion even easier to do. And the 2026 LER Ecosystem Report explicitly includes self-attested evidence. So this isn't just for wild claims, it's for filling gaps in your recognition profile and then looking for support. For example, I was part of the committee that developed an IEEE standard. I got a certificate, but not a badge, so I issued one myself, supported by evidence, the certificate, and an excerpt from the standard showing my name, and endorsements from the committee co-chairs. People talk about resume worthy. I'd say that qualifies. And it's certainly part of my badge portfolio, along with some other self-assertions. Okay, climbing out of the rabbit hole, let's sum up the framework. With examples for the types, I hope some of them resonate with you. They can be stacked in various ways in different contexts. It's important to note that badges can span categories and have multiple features that are would be in other categories. And the next version will include various ways to recognize organizations, because organizations can learn and achieve too. It's Creative Commons, and the current version can be found at learningagents.ca. So it's out there for anyone to use or adapt in any way they choose. No matter what your framework, it's all about transparency. Be clear about what you're claiming, and then make sure you support your claim with appropriate metadata. Okay, moving to a conclusion. Here's an example of the framework in action issued by the Canadian Association for Prior Learning as part of the first International Day of Recognition on June 9th this year. I'm proud to have been a part of this historic event, and I have this badge as proof. It's not a micro-credential, but it is a learning capsule for the day. It includes a link to the recorded proceedings and my reflections on what I learned that day. It's just one example. As I mentioned, the framework is free to adapt, and we can explore how that works here. Here are the 6 categories I was showing you earlier, and the 7 badge types that form the collection there, and their stacked versions. You could decide to simplify this by combining the assessed badges, or combining the organized learning badges, or by combining the evidence and performance badges. I do think it makes sense to hang on to the flexible recognition badge. So now you have 4 badge types plus the stacked badges, and you can simplify further if you wish. So this framework continues to evolve. Looking forward, as I mentioned, we're interested in the recognition of learning organizations and learning collectives in general. So cities of learning, regional talent pipelines, and so on. There are lots of ways of looking at levels. Europe and Australia have national qualification frameworks, for example, with levels. We don't have that in North America, but we have a bunch of other leveled frameworks. The question is, how can qualitative judgments about level be portable across an ecosystem? It's an interesting row to hoe. I mentioned that achievement type needs work, and I'd be happy to contribute to that if they'll have me. I hope I've made a case for the hidden value of endorsement. I think there's lots more that can be done with endorsement after issuing, for example, what I call post facto. Maybe the endorsement credentials in Open Badges version 3 can help that along. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I came to badges through the recognition doorway and ePortfolios, showing what you know and can do, supported by evidence. But authentic evidence portfolios have been hard work for both learners and assessors over the years. That's why I'm excited to be working now with SkillsAware, AI skills mapping engine that does the heavy lifting for humans while leaving them in charge. Skills and evidence as portable, scalable data that can be embedded in badges. That's for another presentation, who knows, maybe Badge Summit 27. You can learn more about this framework if you haven't experienced TMI in an upcoming paper on pleo.org. That's the International Journal on Recognition. As I share this presentation in August, there's only an abstract on the website, but the full version will be published there in a matter of weeks. And so that's it, a tour of the Learning Agents Flexible Recognition Framework. And if you learned something or if you want to find out more, I encourage you to apply for a badge from Learning Agents for this session, where you can reflect and feedback on what I've shared. The badge application is open until August 31st. It'll be like the badge I was showing you earlier. It'll be a professional learning capsule containing a link to the presentation and this recording along with your own reflections, something you can refer to in the future. Otherwise, I welcome any feedback you may want to provide or questions by email, and maybe I'll see you at a future badge summit.